Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Phyllis Leffler. I'm current president and board chair of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, and I welcome you to tonight's talk by Caroline Janney. This program, and it is a first for us, is actually being sponsored by one of our board members, by our current vice president, whose name is Ted Coates. And Ted currently, as I said, serves as vice president, but came up with the idea that he thought it would be great if individual people were interested in a particular subject and might be inclined to give some funds in sponsorship of that. Now, I'm following the other speakers, so I feel a little bit like this is a bad time to make this pitch, but I'm going to take the time to make it anyway. And just say that, you know, we are a 501c3 organization. Every dollar we spend, we have to raise. So we don't get any money from the state. We don't get any money from the city or the county. I think a lot of people did not know that when we recently sent out our survey, but we have now learned that people don't know it. So it's important for me to tell you that. And so these kinds of events that we do, this entire series that we're doing, and so much else of what we do is free to you, but of course it's not free of cost. So we make up the difference by encouraging people to be members. We have brochures here, we have different levels of membership, and we also ask people to support our work in just general ways through donations. And that's the end of that part of my talk right now. Instead, I'm going to shift gears and welcome you to the third part of our series, which we're calling Fighting for Freedom. This series is being done in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Every history-based organization, national, state, local, school, whatever, is doing something. And we have decided, instead of doing one-off talks, as we have in the past, that we would frame an entire series called, as I said, Fighting for Freedom, the legacy of the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration summarized, as you all know, the reasons for the colonies to sever ties with England, calling for the creation of a sovereign nation. But as we all know, that did not come without a fight. And there have been numerous times when people have had to stand up to fight for a better version of America, one that would be more consonant with the noble claims of the Declaration. At this time of national commemoration and at this time in the history of our nation, we believe it's important to reflect on who fought for freedom, what we are still fighting for, and the myriad ways in which the country improved as a result of that struggle. Clearly a continuing struggle. So tonight, we are thrilled to be able to welcome Caroline Janney. Caroline is the John L. Now III Professor of the American Civil War and also Director of the John L. Now Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia. She's also a graduate of the University of Virginia, but before coming back to assume this new position, she worked as a historian for the National Park Service and taught at Purdue University. She speaks all over the place, nationally and internationally, and she is specifically a named speaker with the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program, and has appeared on numerous television programs, including the History Channel's Grant and Lincoln. She also serves as co-editor of, of the University of North Carolina Press's Civil War America series. And she has authored, co-authored, or edited 9 books between 2008 and now. I really can't imagine how you can do that, but she has. Her latest book, called The End of War, the Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox, won the esteemed 2002 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. She will speak tonight on freedom and liberty in the American Civil War. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Phyllis. That was incredibly generous. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful evening. I never know what to expect anymore. Last week, this time, it was 87 degrees. This morning, when I left the house, it was 22 degrees. So whatever season we're in, thank you for coming out and spending the evening with us. So in addition to freedom, I thought it was important to add liberty to the conversation. And what we're going to do this evening is talk about how freedom and liberty were ideas, ideals, and words that were leveraged by multiple different people and organizations during the Civil War. And we're going to start at a place that you may be familiar with, does this work? Not really, doesn't show up, but right there in the center, you may or may not be able to see one Abraham Lincoln. This is, there doesn't work real well. He's right here. There he is. There he is. That's the best photograph we have of Lincoln at Gettysburg, November 19th, 1863. He had been invited to deliver some brief remarks at the dedication of the first National Soldier Cemetery in the United States. The featured speaker of the evening was Edward Everett, who was an esteemed statesman at the time. He spoke for a mere 2 hours. Lincoln is to give brief remarks, and brief they were. 271 words that took somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes to deliver. But brief as they were, his words offered a new interpretation of the Union, one grounded explicitly in not only the American Revolution, but in the Declaration of Independence. And this was a striking departure because so many people up until this time were talking about the Constitution, but he's going to focus on the Declaration. 77 years ago, he began, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Famous words. How many of you had to memorize this in school at some point? So I should dispel some myths before we go on. No one at the time could have quoted Gettysburg Address. For those of you that have seen the movie Lincoln, when the two soldiers come up to him and quote from the speech, that never would have happened. People aren't memorizing the address until into the 20th century, early 20th century is when it really becomes part of the canon. And that's in the wake of the memorial at Washington, the 1922 dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. It's one of the two big quotes, and that's when the Gettysburg Address becomes part of our common vernacular. Nevertheless, what he said that day would set a new tone. He said that the Civil War had tested whether that nation created by those founders or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. He extolled the sacrifices of the Union soldiers. Another thing to remember, he is not paying any reference to the Confederate soldiers who fought there, to the Union soldiers who had died at Gettysburg, noting that, quote, we have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that the nation might live. He closed with some famous words, the dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And I stress it that way because we now have pretty good evidence that it wasn't the of and the by and the for that was stressed by Lincoln, but it was the people that he stressed. I think Lincoln's words offer us a beautiful and powerful summation of the loyal North's evolving war goals by 1863, which had come to include the preservation of the Union and the emancipation of all enslaved people. But even as Lincoln, as loyal white Northerners, as Black people, both enslaved and free, waged a war in the name of freedom and liberty, so too did Confederates argue that they were waging a war for liberty and freedom. And so the question that I pose to you tonight is, how could two diametrically opposed sides say that they were fighting for the exact same things? So what we're going to do is we're going to explore that tension between liberty and freedom, and then we'll look at the causes of the war, what people said they were fighting for, and then I want to bring the story more locally, and we'll talk about what was happening here in Albemarle, Charlottesville, and at the university during the war. But we're going to start with a game. I've been teaching today, so I'm still in teaching mode. So here we go. I'm going to give you a quote, and you're going to tell me whether it's a Confederate soldier or a Union soldier. All right? First one. The war is a struggle between liberty on the one side and tyranny on the other. Oh, was that way too easy? Okay. We're going to come back to this quote in a little bit. Here's another. This soldier said he was fighting for the guarantee of the rights of property, liberty of action, freedom of thought, religion, and the kind of government that shall assure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Confederate. How many people say Confederate? Okay. And we say? We still at Union? Union, yeah, this is a union. But you can see that fighting for property, part of the notion of what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if we have these ideas, maybe we should explore a little bit more about what the terms liberty and freedom meant. And I should say, I never have this much text up when I do a presentation, but because we're talking about ideas tonight, I thought it was important to give you all a little more text. Okay, so we're going to start. I also co-taught a class with an English professor last semester, so now I'm really thinking about what words meant and how people are defining them. So we're going to start with Webster in 1828. Here's your definition of liberty. Freedom from restraint, in a general sense and applicable to the body or to the will or mind. The body is at liberty when not confined. The will or mind is at liberty when not checked or controlled. A man enjoys liberty when no physical force operates to restrain his actions or volitions. There's liberty. What do we think freedom's going to look like? See liberty, it will say. Exempt a state of exemption from the power or control of another. Liberty. Exemption from slavery, servitude, or confinement. So I point this out as you see Confederates using the terms freedom and liberty as well. And we'll come back and talk about how Lincoln thought about these terms in just a little bit. So this is our starting place as we're thinking about what these terms meant in the mid-19th century. But let's start with talking about what they said they were fighting for. And on this, we're going to start on the Confederate side. We'll start here in Virginia, because in the 1860 presidential election featured 4 candidates. And I point this out, this is what ballots looked like in the 19th century. There was no secret ballot. You showed up at the poll, and your employer or your neighbor, everyone knows who you are voting for. There's also a misconception that no one voted for Lincoln in the South, or that no one voted for Lincoln in Virginia. That's not true. He gets a little over 1,000 votes in Virginia. Now, a lot of those come from states or counties rather, that will become part of West Virginia. But Lincoln absolutely does have some support in Virginia. 4-way race, but you all know how this goes. Virginia goes for Bell, who's the Union candidate, but Lincoln would win the election. Hands down, the popular vote is pretty close. He gets about 40% of the popular vote, but hands down wins the Electoral College. Even if the other 3 candidates had managed to combine their votes, Lincoln still would have won an Electoral College. Now, the Republican platform in 1860 had said nothing about ending slavery where it already existed. What it said was that slavery would be protected where what it said was slavery wouldn't be allowed to continue into the Western territories. I'm just going to show this. Thank you. So no extension of slavery into the territories. Slaveholders, white Southerners, didn't believe Republicans when they said that, especially those in the Deep South or the Lower South. So immediately after Lincoln's elections come calls for secession. South Carolina is the first on December 20th, 1860. South Carolina says, we don't like the results of this election. We are leaving the Union. The fragility of the Union is at play here. By February 1st, 7 more Deep South states or Lower South states have followed them. It's important to point out here, this is less than half of the slave states in February of 1861. 7 out of 15 slave states had left the Union. Well, despite what Confederates would say after the war, they were absolutely crystal clear what secession was about in 1860 and 1861. Here's some more words for you. Georgia has this to say: for the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. So the subject of African slavery, front and center in Georgia's Declaration of Secession. Mississippi states things perhaps even more clearly. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. There is no choice left us but the submission to the mandates of abolition or the dissolution of the Union. All of these documents make crystal clear that slavery is the reason for leaving the Union. But they likewise couch their ability to secede legally, constitutionally, within the revolutionary heritage. Here we can go to South Carolina's declaration, where they talk about the right of self-government, which resulted on the 4th of July in 1776 in a declaration, talking about being free and independent states. It continues, and Virginia will say the same sort of thing, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it. So repeatedly, they are going to invoke the Declaration of Independence, the revolutionary generation. They claim the mantle as the inheritors of the revolution for themselves. When they gather on February 4th, this is still the 7 states that have left the Union. They gather in Montgomery, Alabama, February 4th, 1861, to form a new nation that promises to protect slaveholding forever. They write a new constitution, and I like to tell my students that I can imagine them sitting with the US Constitution right here, a blank piece of paper. They copy, 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 yes, 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 we like all these things. Here are a few exceptions, and they make their changes, which includes forever protecting the institution of slavery. Also includes things like limiting the presidency to 1 6-year term. There's a couple of other new tariffs. But really, what they are doing first and foremost is protecting the institution of slavery. They also insisted that they were not acting in a radical or revolutionary way. So despite their claims to the revolutionary past, they say what we're doing is trying to protect the status quo. We are trying to protect what the founding fathers put in place. They said the founding fathers had put up had created a slaveholding republic. We're only trying to keep that. They point out they are imbibing the spirit of 1776. The people of the Confederate States of the South alone remain loyal to the principles of the Revolution. So even though they're claiming the Revolution, they're saying, look, we're not revolutionary here. We're not being radical. We just want to keep things as they are. They say the states as a group had authorized the federal government to act on their behalf, that they had not given up their sovereignty in 1787. And so they say they're just reclaiming what had always been the case. They quote from the Declaration in their founding documents that you can dissolve a government that was unjust. They claim that the Confederacy will be the more perfect union, cleansed of the notion that all men were created equal. Because they explicitly say Jefferson Davis will say this, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, will say, this is a slaveholding nation in which enslaved people, not that that's the term they use, but are inherently not equal to white men. So they're taking what they want from the founding documents, leaving out that inconvenient part from the Declaration of Independence. Some of them even turned the narrative around and said that it was white Northerners and abolitionists who were being radical, that they're trying to destroy what the revolutionary generation had put in place. Now, the secession of the 7 states, the creation of the Confederate States of America in February of 1861, and you can see what they do here on their seal. Who's that on their seal? George Washington. I don't know if you can see the date, February 22nd. So the first president, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, are elected as temporary figures until elections can be held. And the final inauguration, the official inauguration of them, will be February 22nd, 1862, which is Washington's birthday. So again, claiming the mantle of the revolutionary generation. Up to this point, it's always important to remember that secession does not equal war. There could have been a case in which these states were allowed to go and remained out of the Union. Or maybe there's some sort of compromise. Throughout February of 1861, there were meetings being held in Washington, D.C., trying to come up with some sort of compromise effort that would bring these states back into the Union. In fact, the very first 13th Amendment that was passed, and Lincoln said he would sign it, would have forever and permanently protected slavery. So there are all sorts of compromise efforts that are going on. But in the wake of Fort Sumter, and more importantly, in the wake of Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion, 4 more slaveholding states will leave the Union. So we now have 11 slaveholding states who have left the Union. Now we have reached that great moment in which war is indeed inevitable. Which brings us to the question, not of why these states seceded, but why did men fight? How did they frame what they fought? So we've been talking about leaders up to this point. What if we take it down to the ground level and look at the men in the ranks? What are their reasons for fighting? I like to say that there are 4 F's. I like the alliteration of the 4 F's for fighting. The first was flag or Union. They're fighting for their country, for their nation. And this can be true for Confederate and Union soldiers, but I'm going to continue talking about Confederate soldiers here. They fought for their families, which included their community, defending their homes. They fought for their faith. Many of them would couch things in providential terms. They fought for comradeship, for their friendship, for the men beside them in the ranks. And they fought for ideas about masculinity and peer pressure. Lots and lots of tales of young men who didn't enlist right away, and young women in the neighborhood would do things like send them a hoop skirt or send them petticoats and say enlist or wear this. So we have myriad reasons, and I would suggest that at any given point, any soldier would have said that there were more than one of these reasons, and this is reasons not only to enlist, but to stay in the ranks as well. Many of them, though, would have said that they were fighting, especially in 1861, before conscription begins, for ideological reasons, that they were fighting for their flag, that they were invoking ideas of liberty and freedom. Which begs the question about liberty and freedom among slaveholders. What role did slavery and emancipation play in how enlisted men were thinking? Well, the vast majority of Confederate soldiers did not own slaves, but slavery was still a primary motivating factor. In 1861, we can go to 1860. In 1860, 30% of Southern households had enslaved labor. 30% of Southern households. In 1861, with what would become Lee's Army in Northern Virginia, 4 out of every 9 enlisted men came from a slaveholding family. That means 44% of Lee's army in Northern Virginia came from a slaveholding family, far outstripping the 30% of white Southerners who came from slaveholding families. So slaveholders were disproportionately enlisting in 1861. When the draft comes in, that will change things a bit in 1862. But even for non-slaveholders, they understood that slavery underscored and underpinned every aspect of life in the South. You cannot understand the antebellum South, the slaveholding South, without understanding that slavery underpinned religion, politics, where people lived, gender relations, every single aspect. And so when people say, well, my ancestor wasn't a slaveholder, he couldn't have been fighting for slavery, he was fighting for a slaveholding nation that was set in motion to protect that. They also had ideas about personal liberty and freedom that were not necessarily centered on freedom, or centered on slavery, excuse me. They didn't want someone else telling them what to do. And if we think about these young men, the average age of a soldier was 25 years old. Let me tell you, I spend a lot of time with early 20-somethings. They don't want people telling them what to do. Neither do 13-year-olds, for that matter. But this is what many of them said they were fighting for. They were fighting for that freedom, for that liberty. So I'll have some more quotes, 2 more quotes that should offer an example. The Vandals of the North are determined to destroy slavery. We must all fight, and I choose to fight for Southern rights and Southern liberty. You see that term come up. Another soldier, this is John Lee Holt, writing to his wife, if we should suffer ourselves to be subjugated by the tyrannical government of the North, our property would all be confiscated, and our people reduced to the most abject bondage and utter degradation. Pay attention to that word, degradation. We're going to see that again. I think every Southern heart should now respond to the language of the great Patrick Henry in the days of '76 and say, give me liberty or give me death. After Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect on January 1st, 1863, we see even more emphatic pronouncements along these lines. One of those is this. The proclamation, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, is a savage and brutal policy which leaves us no alternative but success or degradation worse than death. Anybody know who said that? Robert E. Lee has this to say to the Secretary of War. The end of slavery gives us no alternative but success. We either have to win this war or we're going to face degradation. That term is used a lot. Degradation worse than death. Another enlisted man. The war is a struggle between liberty on the one side and tyranny on the other. We heard this quote earlier. This young man had decided to espouse the holy cause of Southern freedom. So again, those terms of liberty and freedom being used by both sides. Let's turn to Union soldiers. If Confederates are claiming the mantle as the rightful heirs of the revolutionary spirit, even embracing the patriot notion of rebel, Unionists likewise claimed that they were perpetuating the spirit by keeping the Union together. And like Confederates, they had ideas about personal liberty and freedom that were not necessarily about slavery. They're about their own personal freedom. Overwhelmingly, Union soldiers fought first and foremost to preserve the Union, to put the Union back together. They believed that secession was treasonous. They were not fighting to end slavery so much as to end the slaveholders' rebellion, to put this nation back together. This is Lincoln's goal from the beginning. I love this image, and I'm not sure if you can make it out. This is a picture from San Francisco, February 22nd, 1861. So this is George Washington's birthday. And if you can see, they're quoting Daniel Webster here, not the dictionary Webster. The Union, the whole Union, and nothing but the Union. But here we have liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. So this notion of liberty is tied to union. You can't have liberty if you don't have a union. One of the hardest things I find to teach my students is why a northern farm boy from Wisconsin, or a newly arrived immigrant from New York, or a kid from Kansas would leave the only place he's ever seen and go off and fight for an abstract concept like the union. I think we've lost what union meant at this point. This is a generation who many of their grandfathers had fought in the Revolutionary War. They had grown up hearing these stories. They knew how fragile this union experiment was, how fragile democracy was. They need only look across the Atlantic to the failed revolutions in Europe of 1848. They need only look at how monarchies were regaining control. In 1862, they need only look south to Mexico to see European powers vying to put a monarchy in place in Mexico. This Republican, small r Republican experiment was precious, and it gave Americans, we tend to talk about American exceptionalism being a bad thing today, but in the 19th century, they absolutely embraced the notion that the US was a special place with a special set of rights, of liberty, based in union. And this is what motivates so many of them to fight. The war would be a test of whether or not this nation so conceived would in fact endure. So we see lots of things about the Union and the Constitution hearkening back to Lady Liberty and other examples of how we can secure and make sure that this endures for future generations. So let's hear some voices from some Union soldiers. William T. Shepard from Illinois to his mother, April 21st, 1861, so pretty early on. Our two American principles of freedom and liberty must be preserved. Lots and lots of quotes along this line. Thomas Smith, an officer in the 54th Ohio, writing a year later, said he was fighting for the guarantee of the rights of property, liberty of action, freedom of thought and religion, and the kind of government that shall assure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So again, we have that language being used. A very small percent, certainly no more than 10%, would have said that emancipation was a key motivator for them. That was a reason they were taking up arms. The abolitionist percentage of the population in the white North, historians estimate somewhere between 1% and 3%. So we're talking a very small percentage of people. And certainly 10% or less than soldiers would have said that they were fighting to end slavery. Now, as the war went on, and as it becomes increasingly clear the degree to which slavery underpins the Confederate ability to wage war, when it becomes clear that the Confederacy is impressing enslaved labor to build fortifications or to run factories, which allows more white men to serve in their ranks, it becomes increasingly clear that targeting slavery, ending slavery, is a way of preserving the Union. And so we start to see some shifts in opinions. We also see a lot of negative reaction to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, certainly in the Midwest, certainly in Kentucky, men who say, I'm not fighting, that's not what I signed up to fight for. Even by the end of the war, most white Union soldiers would have said that the key was restoring the Union. And if emancipation came along the way as a way of punishing the slaveholding South, all the better. But for most of them, when they talked about liberty and freedom, they were talking about their own liberty and freedom. That certainly was not the case for Black Americans. For the overwhelming majority of Black Americans, be they free or enslaved, North or South, from the very beginning, the war was about liberty and freedom, but a very particular type of liberty and freedom. When Congress authorized the enlistment of Black soldiers, the United States colored troops, in March of 1863, the call to arms was framed in the terms of liberty. Men of color to arms, again, battles of liberty and the Union. We see this language used repeatedly. Frederick Douglass told white Americans that freedom to enslave people would bring peace to the nation, saying if you end slavery, this is what will restore the Union. Here we have him saying, freedom to the slave will come peace and safety to your country. So even if you're not fighting out of some notion that Black people should not be enslaved, you should know that ending slavery will help end this rebellion. So Douglass is very cognizant of what his goals are, but also a way of motivating the loyal white North. He goes on to say that it's about citizenship as well, that if Black men can prove their mettle, once they get that eagle on their shoulder, once they get that button that says United States, they're not just free, they can be citizens of this union as well. So their goals from the beginning, African Americans, enslaved, free, soldiers, civilians, will focus on liberty and freedom as it related to ending slavery and emancipation. Again, we're left with the questions of what did freedom mean? What did liberty mean? And I think Lincoln sums it up really well here. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. In the free states, he mused, the word may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor. For slaveholders, in contrast, it may mean to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. I think this is a really powerful summation of Lincoln differentiating between these things. So, as we know, the war settled the question, at least to some degree, on the side of the Union. Confederate defeat did mean emancipation, especially with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of '65, and the abolition of slavery would spread throughout the nation, wouldn't end in Kentucky until December of '65. Yet the question remained for both newly emancipated Black Southerners and former rebels, what would freedom and liberty mean in the post-war period? Well, I'm actually not going to answer that question right now. I'm going to shift and bring the story more locally and ask what this looks like here in Albemarle County. So here we have our map from 1860. I could spend all day looking at maps, but this is a reference point for you to think about who is living here. In 1860, according to the census, there were roughly 27,000 residents of Albemarle, 14,000 of whom were enslaved, meaning that more than 50% of Albemarle County residents in 1860 and when the war began in 1861 were enslaved. 10% of the white population enslaved others, so about 1,300 slaveholders. And of that 1,300 number, 254 of those enslaved 10 or more slaves. So more than 100 enslaved people lived and worked on UVA grounds. So we have to keep in mind who is making up Albemarle County and then how their stories play out. So now we're going to go back to the spring of 1861 as Virginia is debating secession. In February of '61, when those 7 states are meeting in Montgomery, Virginia will call a convention, a secession convention. They will have delegates nominated from each county. Here in Albemarle, the 2 delegates were Stephen Valentine Southall, here on the left, and Professor James Holcomb, there on the right. Albemarle, as you might be able to tell from this map right here, on the April 4th vote, Albemarle County would split its votes. Virginia votes overwhelmingly not to secede on April 4th. The county commissioners from Albemarle split those votes, with Southall voting against it, Holcomb voting to secede. As soon as the firing of Fort Sumter and Lincoln calls for troops, they will quickly, on April 17th, they will quickly change their mind. The entire state will change its mind and vote to secede, leaving the Union. Once Virginia leaves the Union, military companies, which had already been drilling, many of them had been drilling since John Brown's raid in October of 1859, they start to come together, start to coalesce. In April of '61, 4 infantry companies organized in town at the university, including the Sons of Liberty. Again, you can hear hearkening back to the Revolutionary War, none other than Rob Lee, one of Robert E. Lee's sons, who was attending the university at the time, joined the Sons of Liberty military company. In May, the 19th Virginia Infantry would be formally organized by local men with UVA and West Point grad Philip St. George Cock as its colonel. There would also be a cavalry unit, the Albemarle Light Horse Cavalry, that would be raised locally, and cavalry that would become the 2nd Virginia Cavalry. So we have lots of early men rallying around the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag would be raised above the rotunda. It had been raised above the rotunda before Virginia ever left the Union, and one of the professors had to climb up there and take it down, but on April 17th, it went right back up. Those who remained on the home front supported the war in other ways. Manufacturing was one such way. The Charlottesville Manufacturing Company, the woolen mills, as you know them, operated cotton and woolen mills producing Confederate uniforms. After the war, this will be one of the things that gets torched by the Union in March of '65. After the war, it will rebuild and will create and will eventually sell Confederate veterans uniforms. So the Confederate veterans groups that organized in 1889 and later, the woolen mills will produce some of their uniforms. Another company here in Charlottesville, McKinney and Company, opened in July of 1861 to manufacture swords. They didn't produce very many. They're very difficult to find now, but they did produce swords in town. And yet another company, J. Wells and Brothers, produced artificial limbs, including one for John B. Hood. He had lost his right leg at the Battle of Chickamauga in September of '63. He was convalescing in Richmond, and he had a limb that was produced here in Charlottesville. And there's some great quotes about how the Charlottesville limbs were some of the best to be produced. So swords and limbs, you have got both ends of the action there. Charlottesville also became home to a major hospital complex, the Charlottesville General Hospital. I think there's some misconception that this was only housed at the university, and certainly the rotunda, the lawn, several of the buildings on the university property were absolutely part of the hospital complex, but it also spread out across the city. Churches, towns, homes, hotels, all became part of this very large complex. Charlottesville was chosen because of its location on the railroad. You can see you've got the railroad coming from the valley, and you also have the O&A, the Orange and Alexandria, coming from Northern Virginia. This direct access to Richmond means that it is perfectly located. Civil War is the first war in which railroads will be used so extensively. And the hospital opens in July of 1861, just in time to receive the wounded from Manassas Junction, from the first battle of Bull Run or Manassas on July 21st. And soldiers will be sent via the Orange and Alexandria to the complex here. Over the course of the war, some 22,000 patients would be seen at the General Hospital. The records are at small special collections. You can go and leaf through and find information about these soldiers. And anyone who's ever done any work in the compiled service records, which are the individual records for soldiers, you'll come across the General Hospital in Charlottesville on many occasions for soldiers that were treated here. The hospital employed some 300 Charlottesville residents and UVA students. A few free Black women served as nurses in the hospital, initially earning $18 a month in October of 1861. But the Confederate government also conscripted many enslaved people and many free Blacks living in and around Charlottesville to labor in the hospital. There were 500 beds spread out across the complex, staffed by some 15 to 50 doctors, depending on any given time. One of those, a name you might recognize, Dr. James L. Cabell, who was a professor of anatomy and surgery at UVA, became the chief doctor. There was also, though, Dr. Oriana Moon, an Albemarle County native and superintendent of nurses. She had attended medical college in Philadelphia, graduated in 1857, one of 38 women who held a medical degree in the US at that time. She worked here at the hospital complex for only a few months. She and her husband were working here together, and then they both left and went to Richmond, where they continued to serve in the medical field. Black residents of Charlottesville and Albemarle, however, were not just impressed to work at the hospital. The Confederate government also impressed them to labor in a host of other capacities. Free blacks between the ages of 15 and 50 were required to report to the courthouse, where they would be examined by a doctor from the hospital to determine where and how they should labor. And despite the protests of enslavers, enslaved people were impressed by the Confederate government. Our statistics suggest that between 1862 and 64, some 940 enslaved people from Albemarle County were impressed to work, to labor on behalf of the Confederate government. For most of the war, other than the hospital complex, other than the manufacturing, battles don't really touch this area. There's a small battle out at Rio Hill. You can still go there and see some waysides. As an aside, my son, who's a 7th grader, was complaining about me always stopping to show historic sites. And we were coming from the soccer fields at Polo Ground Road one night, and he was with a friend, and they said, well, at least there's no place you could stop here and make us look at a sign. And I pulled into that parking lot here behind IHOP and said, yes, I can. So don't challenge me on those things. Anywho, for the most part, not a lot of military action in this vicinity until March of 1865. I put this picture up as a reminder what had happened in the valley in 1864 when Union troops had made their way to VMI. VMI had been torched and burned to the ground. And on March 3rd, when none other than George Custer arrives in town, there's great fear that the same thing will happen to the university, or perhaps even to Monticello. On that day, officials from the university and the town meet at a place that is approximately close to where the UVA chapel stands today. They meet with Custer and his staff and convince him of the historical significance of the university, its connection to Jefferson. And the delegation persuaded members of Custer's staff to spare the university. The university was spared, but much of the rest of the town was not. The woolen mills, as I've mentioned, were torched. Provisions were taken. Lots of other surrounding farms, plantations, things were taken as the Union Army needed it. But the university, Monticello, were protected. And that became a story of lore and part of the story of reconciliation in the post-war years. I point all this out, though, because rather than seeing March 3rd as a day of defeat, we need to better understand it as a day of liberty and freedom, keeping in mind that the vast majority of county residents were Black, or Black, and many of them enslaved. So now, on March 3rd, you may be aware of some of the celebrations here in Charlottesville. This is Freedom and Emancipation Day in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Celebrating this was the case for many, many African Americans, but we know the story of one quite well. One local man who fought in the Union Army, James T.S. Taylor. Taylor was born to a free Black family in Berryville, Virginia in 1840, moved with his family to Charlottesville around the age of 10, where he trained as a shoemaker under his father's guidance. And in 1862, at the age of 22, he ran away from Charlottesville to avoid being impressed into the Confederate service. He made his way to Northern Virginia and ultimately to Washington, D.C. And in 1864, he would write a letter to President Lincoln describing the ordeal he had undergone as he made his way to Union lines in Fairfax County. Here's what he had to say. Having left my home in Charlottesville, Albemarle County, Virginia, to avoid the rebel service, my journey was almost in peril in deluding the rebel pickets and finally reaching the Union lines in safety. He told Lincoln that upon reaching the Union lines, he gave the general all the information respecting the enemy and whereabouts that I know of. So this is another, I think, underreported story, the ways in which enslaved men and women provided intelligence to the United States Army. It's happening all over the Confederacy, but here's a specific example. There's a notion that that the 180,000 Black men who served in the United States Army all did so willingly, and that is not the case. Doesn't seem to be the case for Taylor either. In August of '63, he was drafted into the service of the United States Colored Troops, specifically the 2nd USCT. He served as a commissary sergeant. He wrote letters to the New York Anglo-African, one of the country's leading Black newspapers. And in April of 1865, while he was stationed in Key West, he married Eliza Ann Delancey. When he mustered out of service in January of '66, the couple returned to Charlottesville, where they raised 11 children. And in 1867, with the onset of Congressional Reconstruction, Taylor was sworn in to Virginia's Constitutional Convention. He's one of the delegates from right here in Charlottesville, where he championed Black civil rights, Black political rights. He remained active in Virginia politics for the next several decades, supporting Republican candidates for state and federal office. He ran 2 unsuccessful campaigns for a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates. So this is one of the many, many stories that we can tell about that other portion of Albemarle County. The story of Confederates has been told quite a bit, but at the Now Center, we are trying to recover the voices of other individuals. In November, we were able to dedicate a historic marker, thanks in large part to my assistant, Brian Newman, who has done a tremendous amount of work on this project. So if you go to Oakwood Cemetery, you can visit Taylor's grave, but you can also see this historic marker unveiled just in November. I also encourage you to visit the Now Center's website if you want to learn more about the stories of these individuals. So we have entire stories about people like Taylor. You can read the letter that he wrote to Lincoln in 1864. But we also have the stories of 254 other Black soldiers who were born here in Albemarle County and served in the USCT. I have 6 sailors as well. So overall, the war had an enormous impact on the county, on the town, on the university, in every way that you can imagine. Again, it has for many years been told as a Confederate story, but we're trying to change that narrative, to work on recovering the stories of those who challenged the story. So in addition to the Black Virginians in blue, we have also found 64 UVA students and 5 faculty members that fought for the Union Army as well. Those of you that are familiar with grounds might be familiar with Tuttle Dormitory. Tuttle was a Union soldier who came from Ohio and served as a science professor in the years after the war. All of this to say, and I'm sure I will have even people in the audience who may disagree with me, but I sincerely believe that the Civil War was the single most important moment in American history. It was won by a coalition of loyal Americans, white and Black, men and women, free and unfree, determined to uphold the Union created by the Revolutionary generation. Indeed, many scholars have referred to it as the Second American Revolution, or the Second Founding. And perhaps we should consider that. Perhaps we should see it as such, as a second chance to do better than the Revolutionary generation, to truly offer a new birth of freedom, so that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Thank you.
Do you want to do, we could do some questions?
Sure.
A few questions?
You mentioned what percent of the Confederate soldiers were slave owners. Do you have any idea of the officer group?
Officers are even higher percentage. I can't rattle that number off to you off the top of my head, but Joe Glatar, who was a historian in the Civil War at the University of North Carolina, has a book that fat, specifically on Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, and those numbers are even higher than if we look at just the enlisted men. We know that 1 out of every 9 soldiers in 1861 took an enslaved body servant with him to camp. And that included both officers and enlisted men. Some of you know I'm finishing a book on John Mosby, and he was a private in 1861, and he too takes an enlisted man, a man named Aaron Burton, who was lived here in Charlottesville, both while he was enslaved by the Mosbys, but after the war as well. Very common for that group of men. So it's all across the ranks, but even more of the officer corps would have been slaveholders.
You talked at the beginning and you compared the words freedom and liberty used both by the Confederate side and by the Union side. And with the Confederates, do you think it's something that evolved over time where they started to think that way? Did that have something to do with so many of the founding fathers, you think, were Southern, were from the South and more slaveholders?
Right. I mean, that is absolutely the case. And there's the famous quote that I will probably butcher from the Revolutionary era about how do the loudest yelps for liberty come from the mouths of enslavers. And so, but that notion had been there all along, that you're fighting to, whether it's the revolution against King George or against the Yankees, to preserve what you see as your basic rights. So that language is pretty consistent over time, but we do see a lot of it kind of bubbling up to the surface. I don't think it changes that much. Yes, sir.
I read a book a couple of years ago about the lack of personal freedom in the Confederate South. And it talked about how you needed a pass to travel anywhere, and how a junior officer in the Confederacy could lock someone up for something they said. And there was a story about someone who had expressed anti-secessionist feelings before secession, and he was locked up. And it talked about how the government set up these habeas commissioners who went around to determine if there was a case. And can you talk about that? I was really surprised by that.
Sure. So there's kind of 2 parts to that. The first is that the Confederate government will talk a lot about states' rights, and they mean the individual states' rights to control their domestic institutions. And domestic institutions absolutely include slavery. It also includes things like marriage. And the notion that they are fighting to preserve states' rights is ironic in the sense that the Confederacy becomes an incredibly powerful national government. It is the first to conscript people into service. It levies taxes, it impresses goods. And yes, Jefferson Davis suspends habeas corpus. So there is kind of a top down, and this is why there is splintering. There's no political parties in the South. That's another way in which they hearken back to the American Revolution. They say George Washington didn't have a party, and we know the Federalist and the Republican Democrats, or Democrat Republicans, whichever we're calling them these days, that become Jefferson, that parties did develop, but the Confederacy will initially say there's no parties, and what it becomes then is a pro-Jefferson Davis versus an anti-Davis faction. And that anti-Davis faction, which includes the governors of North Carolina, the governor of Georgia, will say, look, this is precisely what we were fighting for. We were fighting for liberty, we were fighting for freedom, and now you have this massive federal government that is curtailing us and trying to tell us what to do. So there's that part, but at the same time, this notion of suspending habeas corpus, Lincoln does the same thing. And throughout the loyal North, there are newspapers that are attacked and burned. There are soldiers that are arrested for saying anything derogatory, anything negative about the government, anything that smacks of secession. So that is happening on both sides. That's not just something happening in the Confederacy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you spoke compellingly about what motivated men in the South to leave their homes and fight, and what motivated men in the North. And it's understandable to me that the men in the North said we want to preserve the Union. And you showed some quotes from men in the North also talking about freedom and liberty. And I don't know why they saw the war as giving as a threat to their freedom, the South seceding as a threat to their freedom and liberty.
Because
why would that be important?
No, it's a great point. So it's a couple of things. One is that it is a threat to the Union, which preserves that liberty and freedom. And if the Confederacy goes, you might have a balkanization of the US. Maybe New England's going to split off. Maybe what we call the Midwest today will split off. The Western states will split off. And if that starts happening, is that going to be a threat to these small r Republican values and democracy? But they inherently saw slaveholders and the slaveocracy, as they would have called it, that slaveholders had controlled all three branches of the government up to this point. They controlled Congress in many ways. They controlled certainly the Supreme Court. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision had said that slavery could go anywhere. It doesn't matter whether this is a free state. If you have an enslaved person, you can bring them to Wisconsin. You can bring them to Illinois. And so they saw that as a threat to free labor, the free labor ideology. And maybe I should have talked more about that. And free labor meaning that a man is free to labor for himself and to reap the benefits and the income and everything else that comes from laboring on behalf of yourself. And it's this competition, especially when we look at places like Kansas and Nebraska, that free white men don't want to have to compete with enslaved labor. And so they see slavery and the slaveocracy as a fundamental threat to their ability to live and act as free white men.
That was basically the same, it was the quote by Thomas Smith, and that they felt threatened with the rights of property, liberty of action, and in fact, I thought, but why? Because
They don't want to have to compete
Yeah.
with slaveholders. And I mean, this is a question that comes up with California in 1849, following the rush, the gold rush, as California, the Compromise of 1850 in many ways is about whether or not to admit California as a free state. And part of that, there's even discussion about California becoming two states, but there's so many slaveholders that are taking slave labor out to the mines. And this is just one of many, many examples. And people are saying, we can't compete with that. Or if you're on the plains of Kansas, how are you supposed to compete with slave labor? And so it's the notion of individual men being able to prosper for themselves and their family without having to compete with the slave oligarchy. Yes, ma'am.
So what did the states like Kentucky, Maryland still have slaves? What did they think of the Emancipation Proclamation? West Virginia?
Well, West Virginia, when it becomes a state, it comes in 1863 on the condition that it will end slavery. So that's a no-go. Kentucky is beyond apoplectic. And I mean, I say that in all sincerity. Men who had signed up, here's the other kind of, we have to flip how we think on its head. People in Virginia who voted for the Union candidate, John Bell, in the 1860 election, believed sincerely, and maybe they had every reason to, that the Constitution protected slavery. And they were better off staying in the Union with a Constitution they knew that would protect slavery. So those other 4 border states, and Delaware, of course, has a really small percentage of enslaved people at this point. But Kentucky has a significant portion. Maryland has a significant portion. They're gambling on the fact that the Union will protect, as it had so far, making compromise after compromise to protect the interest of slaveholders. And so Kentucky is gambling on that. And then when the tables are turned, they see it as such. Many Union men either desert or refuse to fight anymore. There's a notion that Kentucky becomes Confederate after the war. You might also say it becomes Confederate even though it's not officially part of the Confederacy after 1863 because people are so upset. Maryland has a referendum in 1864. They don't allow people who have left Maryland and joined the Confederacy to vote. I wish I had that slide with the numbers in front of me. Because the vote is very, very thin in favor of emancipation. And if they had allowed the Confederates who left the state to vote, they would have voted no to ending slavery. So there's a fight to the end to protect the institution. How much more time?
Do you want more?
Okay, you pick.
you pick.
Why do I have to pick? I saw your hand.
All right, thank you. Your reference to free labor seems important.
Yeah.
But Lincoln was a lawyer, and what did Lincoln base his legal argument on, saying that it was illegal for the Confederate States to secede?
So I don't know that he ever says that it's illegal for the states to secede. He says that this is a compact and you have agreed to this compact. And so I'm not going to answer your question by answering a slightly different question. And that is, so Lincoln doesn't exactly respond to that directly. And actually Lincoln wants to have it both ways. He wants to treat the Confederacy as states in rebellion. And he says, you know, you've never left the Union. I don't acknowledge that secession has happened. So that's one way he gets around it. Secession is not a thing. It can't happen. Therefore, you are states in rebellion. You have not left the Union and created the Confederacy. On the other hand, he simultaneously treats them as a belligerent foe. They're prisoners of war. You don't take prisoners of war if you are putting down an insurrection. There's a blockade. You can't blockade your own nation. And so it's this dual notion of whether or not the Confederacy is a separate nation or not. But on the question of secession, 1865, May 10th, 1865, Jefferson Davis is captured in Georgia. He's been on the run. Richmond has fallen on April 3rd. He's taken off. He's convinced that, at one point, he's convinced that the war can continue if only he can get his Western armies in shape. He's making his way through Danville, through North Carolina, makes his way into Georgia when he's captured. And he's imprisoned at Fort Monroe, Hampton Roads. You drive across the bridge tunnel, you can see Fort Monroe, you can go visit the cell he was held in. He's held there for 2 years. And the United States government is trying to bring a case against him for treason. They ultimately don't, because they conclude that secession very well may have been constitutional. And so rather than bring the case against them, against Jefferson Davis, let him go. Don't try this. Cynthia Nicoletti, who's a professor at the law school, has a fantastic book about Jefferson Davis's trial, or more precisely lack thereof, and why the United States government thinks it's in their best interest not to follow that line. All right, thank you all.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much.
Of course.
It's been wonderful. We hope you'll join us for more of our program series. Our next talk will be here on April 16th. Same room, same time, just different day. So I hope that you all will join us for that. Professor Andrew Carl will be speaking about how tax policies and the various struggles for economic equality. So we hope you'll join us for that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Get home safely.
Please take the brochure on your way out.
Thank you.
You're not already.
Of course. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Caroline.
Good night.